Hey there everybody, Steve the Amateur Historian, coming at you with another mystery story that's kind of been just stacked in I literally have a stack like this high of information that I've taken from various things that I want to do videos on that are just things I haven't covered yet. So there's still a lot more, in particular, in this case, mysterious disappearances, murders that have gone unsolved, John Doe cases, Jane Doe cases, all of that stuff. I still have a lot of cases, and for the most part in the series so far, a lot of the cases have been post 1960, and I'm starting to interject a few cases that predate that maybe would have a little more substance or would not fit as well, as far as I'm concerned, into, say, like a Historic Murders of Portland episode, which during the pandemic I'm not even going out and doing anyway. And this is a story that kind of touches with a lot of other cases. There was this very interesting string, and it seemed to primarily occur during the 30s and 40s and maybe kind of into the 50s a little bit. This string of women getting murdered, kind of more independent women getting murdered, and really seemingly minimal effort being put into actually really figuring out who was responsible. These cases that would be in the headlines for a week and then just vanish forever. And newspapers back in the day, they stuck with cases a lot. Even if it was a case that went unsolved for a long period of time, when it was finally resolved, they would jump back on it. And these were cases that were just there for the moment and disappeared, which tells me they were never officially solved. And this is one of the more prominent cases in that bunch. This is the unsolved murder of a Portland woman named Gwen Ponsen. So I did a Historic Murders of Portland episode a while back where I covered two cases of women who were murdered in their apartments, and I think both were really close to 1930, and I covered them both at the same time because their cases had very comparable elements to it, and they were both cases where these women were killed in their own homes, and perceivably they were never solved. And the Gwen Ponsen case ties in very well to that, even though her case didn't happen until 1942. And it's very interesting because in addition to being these cases of these again, for the time, more independent women getting killed, and it seemed like there were possible suspects around, but no resolution was ever found to their cases. It was a very interesting insight into these, in some instances, the earliest days of women in Portland. You know, for obvious reasons, women in Portland actually being able to find work that supported them enough that they could live on their own. That was, especially, heading towards the middle part of the 20th century, that was a very rare thing because women couldn't find good jobs. Women weren't considered as highly as men were for jobs that made decent pay. So a lot of women, obviously didn't work, and women who did work were probably lucky if they could find part-time work or find some job that was traditionally a woman's job, like doing something working in a salon or being a school teacher. And Gwen Ponsen was one of these women. She worked as a stenographer, and she had her own place in Portland. And again, it was right in the thick of World War II, which was, of course, a brief period where a lot of women did find work. But the reason they found work is because we sent all the boys overseas to fight in the war. And of course, when the war ended and they came back, the American attitude was like, okay, well, thank you ladies for the work you did, but time to go back to being a housewife. And so, even then, a lot more women were finding work, but it was always going to be temporary. Society was always going to shove them back into that corner that they expected women to go into. So working as a stenographer, I don't know or think that Gwen Ponsen's work really had anything to do with war-related things. That was just her job. So on the morning of March 15th, 1942, Gwen Ponsen was discovered dead in her apartment that she'd been living in for almost 2 years. The newspaper said that she moved in there in 1940 after a divorce with a previous husband. She was entirely nude. She'd had all her clothes stripped off, but whoever was responsible for killing her had slipped a quilt over her body, like they covered her up afterwards. And there is a kind of considered a kind of psychological thing with some killers, that there is sometimes an essence of shame afterwards. If they attack and kill someone and they're just lying there nude and dead, that they'll cover their bodies. There's other reasons why they would do something like that, but there didn't appear to be any signs of a struggle. So either somebody maybe attacked her when she was asleep, which seems unlikely because she had a party going on at her apartment that seemed to be going into the early morning hours of the 15th. Or the other side is she was attacked, maybe there was a minimal struggle, or if there was a slightly bigger struggle, whoever was responsible kind of tidied things up. And it was noticed in the aftermath that a lamp cord was missing from a lamp in her room, and it was thought that the killer probably ripped that cord off and then used it to choke Gwen Ponsen to death, and then they took, the guilty murder weapon with them when they left her apartment. It was theorized that Gwen was killed sometime between 3 and 6 a.m. Probably the latest she would have been killed would have been 6 a.m. So again, sometime during the early morning hours. And her apartment, it was found that the back door to her place was unlocked. So of course it was immediately thought that that was probably how the killer would have gained access. And her background was looked into to see if she was maybe seeing somebody. Maybe there was some kind of love triangle going on with this. But apparently she wasn't actually seeing anybody at the time. She was single and just living her best life at this time. And she was checked and analyzed to see if there was a sexual motive to her killing. Again, she was found nude, and it was discovered that she had been sexually assaulted. So this was probably a sex killing, as they're generally called. Someone saw an opportunity, broke in, attacked, and then killed her in the aftermath. That was either part of the thrill of that kill, or it was an effort to keep her from being able to expose whoever had sexually assaulted her. It didn't say whether the assault occurred before or after death. Either way is disgusting considering the circumstances. And it does really show, if this is in fact what happened, that somebody, came in through the back door, or somebody saw her as a victim of opportunity, was, again, this idea that this was a time where women were first starting to really be independent and live on their own, during this time. And I could see a lot of sketchy, messed up, violent men in the city taking note that there's all of a sudden there's these women that are living on their own, and seeing them as victims of opportunity. That, oh, here's a woman that's not going home to her husband. This is a woman that's coming home to her own little house or her own apartment or what have you. So if I go there, no one's going to be there to help protect her. And of course, just about any rapist is going to think any woman they go after, they're going to be able to overpower. So it would be very possible that someone like Gwen Ponsen, just in the fact that she was living on her own, that they would think that she would be an easy victim of opportunity. That would just be how their mind would function. And then there is this party that Gwen was having at her place, which is very interesting, having a party at your place that goes into the early morning hours, wherein she could have been killed within 30 minutes of the party breaking up. In essence, the party went into the early morning hours and broke up sometime between 2:30 and 3 a.m. because one of her neighbors started complaining and threatening to make some trouble for them. So I was like, well, I guess the fun's over. And there were reportedly 2 mystery men there. That's how they were reported immediately after the murder happened, was there was 2 men there that nobody seemed to know who showed up at the party, but obviously you'd think somebody would have invited them. And whoever these men were in the moment, they apparently left around 2:30. Now, of course, this doesn't mean one or possibly both couldn't have been involved. They could have left and waited for the party to break up. It seems like they left right around the same time that this neighbor came complaining about the noises they were making. So one or both of them may have thought, you know, this party's breaking up soon, everyone's gonna leave, so we'll just leave now. We'll make it look like we left before everyone else, and then we can loiter around and come back afterwards when suddenly Gwen is all by herself. And the fact that she was, you know, kind of throwing this lavish party in her own apartment, and maybe made these guys think, like, this is a woman that's maybe got a little influence, got a little money to throw around. It's impossible to say. We don't even know for certain if these guys were guilty, but there were 2 mystery men there. And in addition to this, there was reportedly a tan sedan that was seen speeding away from the backside of Gwen Ponsen's apartment at roughly around 3:30 a.m. So this could have been, you know, based on the general area that they think she was killed in, this could have been immediately after she was killed. And this could have been the suspect fleeing. I'm of the opinion that it probably was. I mean, what are the odds that right in that window of time that Gwen Ponsen could have been killed, someone, or, you know, more than one person, are diving into a sedan that's not parked on the street where people can see it, but parked hidden behind her apartment, you know, like it's hidden, and then they speed away from the scene of her apartment. That seems like too many coincidences to me, and I'm fully of the opinion. The problem is we don't know exactly who it was that got in that sedan and drove away, but I'm of the personal opinion that whoever was in that sedan was responsible for Gwen Ponsen's murder. And the neighbors, the whole reason this car, because you're like, why would somebody notice a car speeding away? Why would somebody see that during the 3 a.m. hour? And it was just a couple people that were about to leave on a fishing trip. And anybody who goes on fishing trips knows you usually leave kind of early. And some people just happened to be in that area and were leaving on a fishing trip around 3:30 in the morning. And they saw this tan sedan speed away from the scene. And one of the interesting things they noted, unfortunately they didn't get a good look at whoever was in the sedan for identification purposes later, but they did notice that this sedan was parked in Gwen Ponsen's parking spot. Now, I don't know if that means she didn't have, because you'd think if she had a parking spot, she would park there. So I don't know if she didn't have a car. Maybe she didn't. You know, a lot of people were taking the bus and even the streetcar lines back in those days. So maybe she didn't even have a car. I don't know, but whatever the case, this tan sedan that again sped away from the scene was specifically parked in her parking spot, and there was no suggestion that that was her car and it got stolen, or, you know, some angle like that. It was just that this car was parked in her spot, which is very interesting, very suspicious, and if it was done by the guilty party, kind of stupid. Like, way to draw attention to your getaway car by parking it in the spot of the woman you're about to go murder. So before we return to the case of these mystery men that were seen at Ponsen's apartment, because in the end, there, again, like I said when I first started, there really wasn't a whole lot to this case, or at least what was discovered about it, the investigation. It was just kind of in the papers for, like, you know, a week or so, and then it just vanished. Like a lot of these cases did, of these women living on their own and showing up dead. I know that in the other video I did, there was a woman named Anna Morris who was killed in her apartment, I believe in 1931, and it was this very bizarre story. I think her boyfriend probably killed her, because he had this obscene story that he showed up at her place then around the time she died, and her place was locked up. He went to her back door and saw this other mystery man in her apartment. The man came up to him at the door, was like, "Oh, you need to come back later." And then presumably during that period of time, he killed Ann Morris and then fled the area. And this was the boyfriend story, who conveniently showed up at the scene where she was murdered right after she was murdered. So that was a comparable story, and again, one that didn't seem to get any resolution, but it was another story, really strange story of this woman getting murdered in her apartment in Portland. And one of the first leads that didn't really go anywhere was while authorities were searching Gwen's apartment for anything that could help them, they discovered a letter that Gwen Ponsen had written where reportedly she threatened to commit suicide. And in this letter, she referenced a man who at that time was living in Kelso. They never gave the man's name or explicitly said what his purpose was in this supposed suicide letter. But because his name showed up in there, authorities went to see him to see if maybe he was connected to it, and he denied any involvement, didn't even know why he would show up in this random letter. So maybe he was just a strange guy from her past. Maybe they had a past that both of them would prefer buried and gone. Maybe they had a brief fling that got a little out of control, and they eventually just had to split ways. Nobody knows for certain, but it seems like he wasn't really seriously considered as a suspect. He was just looked into because he showed up in a suicide letter, which is a little odd. But the closest thing to a legitimate suspect, which again didn't really go anywhere because it didn't seem like authorities had enough, was there was a guy named Max Hartman. And Max Hartman was one of these two mysterious guys that was seen at Gwen Ponsen's party hours before, or even potentially less than an hour before she was actually killed. So yeah, authorities were able to at least identify one of these mystery men. Somebody at the party knew him, somebody saw him leaving, whatever the case. This Max Hartman guy was identified as one of these two mystery men that showed up at Gwen Ponsen's party. And so being a mystery guy in this case, obviously authorities were interested in what Max Hartman had to say, and it seems like he actually turned himself in ultimately when he probably read in newspapers that, oh, there was these mystery people that showed up at Gwen Ponsen's party and we want to know who they are. So Hartman willingly turned himself in and said he had met this other guy who, interestingly enough, he never got this other guy's name. So the other mystery guy is still left unidentified, because even Hartman, who spent an extensive period of time with this guy and never got his name, which is strange and I think unlikely and probably gut feeling a lie. He said he met this guy at a tavern near Gwen's place, and after they had a few drinks they went to her place for the party. So I don't know how that came about. I don't know if Max Hartman and Gwen Ponsen really knew each other. Again, it seemed like at the time of the party they were just two strangers that showed up. So what would be the circumstances that would lead these guys to leave a tavern where they're having drinks and then they just show up at an apartment complex and there just happens to be a party going on, presumably with drinks, and they apparently don't know anybody there, but they just show up and go in and like kind of squeeze their way into the party? It's very strange. And yet this seems to be what happened. It is very bizarre. Is how did these guys randomly end up at Gwen Ponsen's apartment when it seems they didn't know there was a party going on there, and it seems like they didn't know anybody there? So how would they just end up there? It was very strange. I almost wonder if maybe Max or his mysterious companion knew something about Gwen Ponsen, maybe had a weird fixation that would then possibly make one or both of them more viable suspects. It's just very strange to me, this oddity that they just randomly ended up at a party with a bunch of people they didn't know. At the apartment of a woman that it seems they didn't know. Because Max Hartman's story was just, oh, I met this guy, we had some drinks, and then we just went to Gwen's place and had some more drinks. And he said that he left around 2:30 when the next door neighbor came to complain. But he did make the point of saying that the guy he came with didn't leave with him. He left on his own, but that guy stayed behind at Gwen Ponsen's apartment. So does this mean this other mystery man was responsible for her murder? Does Max Hartman know the identity of this guy, but maybe they got along well, maybe he was friends with him? Maybe it's sort of a strangers on a train type scenario. Maybe Max Hartman knew Gwen Ponsen well, maybe he had a thing for her and she didn't reciprocate those feelings, so he meets a random guy who has no connection with her and is like, hey, How about we go to this party? I never, and I'll never point out who you are, and then I'll just show up and leave, and then she gets killed afterwards by you. It is kind of a stranger's. If you don't know what I'm talking about, it's the plot to an Alfred Hitchcock movie from the early 50s where this guy willingly kills another guy's ex, who's going to reveal all this damaging information about him. The guy's just a lunatic. That does seem kind of far-fetched, but it is kind of an interesting possibility. And the reason I'm bringing this up is just I find it very interesting that Max Hartman willingly comes forward and makes the point of saying, oh yeah, I left at 2:30 when everyone else did. I left before Gwen Ponsen was murdered. But this other guy I came with, he didn't leave when I did. Like, wink, wink, maybe he's the killer. So either Max Hartman's telling the truth, or at least partially telling the truth, at least about when he left and that he never came back, or he was trying to throw everything at this other guy, whether he was guilty or not. So he comes forward and willingly cooperates, which is something that presumably a guilty person wouldn't do. And then he throws the other guy under the bus by saying, I left, he stayed behind. Now again, the fact that like her back door was cracked open, it almost suggests that whoever did this left and came back. So whether this guy actually did stay behind at Gwen's place when Max Hartman left, doesn't mean the guy didn't leave when everyone else did. And it doesn't necessarily make him the attacker, because it would create the presumption that he probably would have also left and then came back and broke in through her back door. The fact that the back door was cracked open, maybe that was just because of maybe that was just the escape route being used. Again, this presumably getaway sedan was behind her apartment, so they would probably book it out her back door to get to her car. But the fact of the matter is, that was deemed also the point of entry. Her front door was locked, and again, there was no signs of a struggle, so there was no evidence that whoever did this came in through the front door or came and broke through any windows or anything. But again, if it was, that almost makes it more possible that somebody who was just at the party, who stayed behind, was responsible. And the only reason the back door was open wasn't so much that, as the police were theorizing, that was the method someone used to break in, but just simply someone used that method to get out. It's hard to say for certain, but it's possible that could have been used by someone breaking in after the party, or it could have been the last straggler at the party who just used that back door as an escape route and was in such a rush to escape that they just threw the door open and didn't close it, booked it to this tan sedan that would have been right in that area, and sped off. And I really wish I could never find in any articles or any written pieces at all exactly where Gwen Ponsen's apartment was, so I could maybe find some old pictures or diagrams to see exactly how things were structured and how, where her apartment was in relation to her parking space where this tan sedan was. Where would that tan sedan have had to go? What was the nearest busy street? Was it on a busy street? Was it a residential side street? These would have all been interesting questions to know, just to kind of try to get in the mind of the guilty party and how they fled the scene, because I think that the back door being open, the tan sedan being parked in Gwen Ponsen's spot behind her apartment, I feel like that's all interconnected and tied into the murder. And no matter how you play with that, no matter how you shake it up, it still doesn't tell us exactly who was responsible. Honestly, the closest thing we have is Max Hartman and his mystery guy. So either Max Hartman did it and passed it off on that guy, or that guy did it and we don't know who he is, and it seems like authorities never actually figured out who this guy was. Could it have been another random guy that seemed harmless at the party that Gwen Ponsen knew well? Possibly. Could it have been, although the odds seem a little, the fact that this party happened so close to her death, it seems likely that there's a connection between the party and whoever killed her. But it is slightly possible that it's just, the party wrapped up sometime around, between 2:30 and 3 a.m. And a little after the party ended, someone went in and killed her. Somebody could have, somebody who had a fixation on her, someone who, again, knew she lived alone and would be a potentially easy victim of opportunity. They could have shown up that night knowing she lived there, and they could have, waited on a dark street corner. They could have waited in their car when they saw that her lights were on and there was commotion going on because people were partying. He could have stayed there and waited till all that ended. And when the last person left and maybe Gwen Ponsen was ready to go to bed and she turned her light out, this guy finally came out of the darkness, so to speak, broke into her apartment, sexually assaulted her and killed her. The fact that she was sexually assaulted, you know, she wasn't just killed in a robbery gone wrong. It wasn't some passive crime. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't, it wasn't under those circumstances of where someone suddenly felt like, oh God, I have to kill this person. I didn't want to do it. It seems like this was a probably planned sexual assault and then likely murder afterwards. Whoever did this was probably thinking about killing Gwen Ponsen for a while. And it probably wasn't just the somebody randomly showed up at the party. And again, does that tie back into Max Hartman and his mystery companion? It's hard to say. You know, maybe one of them had, you know, demented feelings like that for Gwen Ponsen. One did and the other man didn't know about it. Or maybe the other man did know about it. I mean, there's so many questions. But based on the circumstances, I think in the case of Gwen Ponsen, whoever did it was probably had a lot of animosity towards her, or knew that she was a victim of opportunity and someone that would possibly, they could, you know, take out their disgusting, insatiable, you know, rapist drive on. Or it was maybe somebody that had tried to get her to go out with them and that didn't work out, and they just got, you know, just fiercely angry about that, and they took out that rage on her in one of the most violent ways imaginable. That's always happened. Crazed men who can't handle rejection, and in particularly, especially back in the early half of the 20th century in the Portland area, men who were rejected by women, they took that rage out on those women in some truly troubling and disgusting ways. And fortunately, in most of those cases, those men were caught. But in the case of Gwen Ponsen, that hasn't been the case. Her killer, you know, here we are almost 80 years on from that, and it seems like we still have no idea who did it. And it was such a quick in the papers and gone and forgotten story that it seems unlikely it'll ever be solved, because it seems like even at the time, like, a meek investigation was done, and when the couple of people the police found didn't really pan out, they just kind of threw their hands up and said, well, it's just another one of these unsolved ones, and we'll sit on it until something happens. And that's how a tragic murder like this becomes a cold case and lingers, you know, from that point on in history as an unsolved murder. I think that's going to be the case with Gwen Ponsen, unfortunately. Killed in her apartment in the middle of the night to the early morning hours of March 15th, 1942. And that is the story of Gwen Ponsen. There really isn't a whole lot of information that I was able to find about it, but, you know, I found enough to cover, you know, almost 2 pages, which usually in cases like this I can fill 4 or 5 pages, but I still felt that this was a very troubling case with what happened, with how little effort it seems was really put into investigating it, which again happened in a lot of cases like this back in the day. A lot of these cases of women living on their own, getting murdered in their homes in, you know, a variety of different ways, and some of them obviously sex killings, and they would pop up in the news, and 1 or 2 possible suspects would pop up and then get brushed aside, and then the story would disappear forever to be forgotten. And that's one of the many reasons why I feel like cases such as Gwen Ponsen need to be remembered. Because back then, not enough people cared. So, as always, everybody, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for supporting my channel, especially through, like, you know, series like this where I really put a lot of thought and time and reflection into these, you know, mystery stories that I find. And as always, remember to like, share, subscribe. If you want to help my channel grow, hit up my Patreon if you want to help me out there. I've already got some great patrons on there helping my channel grow, helping me stay above water. And other than that, till next time, thanks again for watching. This has been Steve, the Amateur Historian.